Alright, so Final Fantasy XVI has been out for almost 2 months now, and I'm really just kind of thinking about the game, marinating a little bit more on my thoughts. I did do a non-spoiler review, which kind of goes over all the good and the bad that I saw in the game, but even afterwards, there are new things that I'm thinking of that were missed opportunities that the game could have taken advantage from. And there's one previous Final Fantasy game in particular that I actually think does certain aspects of combat better than Final Fantasy XVI, and it's probably not the game you're thinking of. I fully acknowledge that this is probably going to be a controversial video. I promise you I am not high or drunk, or high and drunk. This is just something I've been thinking about lately. But before we get into that, if you guys could click the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you like what you hear, it would be greatly appreciated. Final Fantasy XVI overall is a really fantastic game. It's got some really high highs, and it also has some really low lows. But one of the things that's mostly consistent throughout the game is the combat. It feels really fun and fresh and responsive, and at times chaotic. Assuming you're fighting some of the bigger enemies or bosses, I found that fighting some of the smaller jobber type enemies that didn't have a stagger bar got old kind of fast, because Clive is so fast and ridiculously strong as you progress through the game that when you run into these types of enemies, you're just gonna mow right past them. And that aspect of combat got really boring really fast. And I really started to think about ways you could freshen up 16's combat, whether it was the standard battles or even some of the boss battles. And the one game that I've been thinking about a lot, stay with me here, is actually Final Fantasy XV. And I know what you're thinking, 15's combat is nowhere near as good as 16. And while you're right, I do think that there are aspects of 15's combat that I think are better that I wish 16 would have taken inspiration from or even utilized in some fashion. So my biggest takeaway here is team up attacks. Now, granted, most of Final Fantasy XVI is just Clive and Torgal. There are sections where it's just Clive, but there's a fair amount of sections where Clive gets to team up with people, whether it's Cid, Jill, Gav, spoiler alert for those who haven't played the game, Joshua, and there are even moments where you have a full party of people, including Cid and Jill and Torgal, or Jill and Joshua in Torgal, or Jill and Gav in Torgal. So it's not like you're fighting solo throughout the whole game. There's a lot of cool team-up sections in that game. And I started to think about the fact that none of these characters have any combat interactions with Clive. It's all everyone just kind of doing their own thing in combat. And while the AI for your teammates is actually pretty competent, there are moments where I'll fight one enemy and Jill and Torgal will separate and fight smaller enemies, and they'll kill those guys before I can even finish off the main big baddie that I'm fighting. So the AI is not the issue. But I start to think about the lack of team-up stuff and interactions, and how it would have been really cool to see like cinematic team-up attacks between Clive and these other characters. Imagine, you know, having a lightning strike team-up attack between Clive and Cid, where maybe Cid stuns the enemy with lightning, and then you can see Clive fly into the air and like slam down with his sword. Or maybe there's a moment where Jill imbues Clive with an ice shield and he takes less damage, or he does a cool sword attack with Jill with the ice on the blade. You kind of see where I'm going here. And of course, you're probably wondering, where does Final Fantasy XV fit into all of this? Well, I think about 15's combat, and while I don't think it's bad, and it doesn't feel anywhere near as good as 16, there are really cool interactions in 15's combat that I still think about to this day. Seeing Noctis team up with Ignis to do this really cool speedy assassin attack was sick. Seeing Gladio use his sword as a ramp for Noctis to run and jump off to deal damage to an enemy. Or seeing Prompto pull out a big ass cannon, Noctis stands behind him bracing his shoulders, Prompto fires, falls back, and then Noctis helps him back up to his feet to keep fighting. It's those little interactions that I really loved from 15 that I wish we could have seen from 16, because the characters in both games are great and they all have really amazing chemistry with one another. And I feel like with 15 you see that and feel it throughout the whole game. It's not just the story stuff and cutscenes, it's running around and exploring with these guys, hearing the banter between them setting up tent at night and watching, you know, them eat dinner or play games on their phone or banter back and forth in battle. You get some banter here and there in 16, but it never really feels like the characters are interacting with one another in battle, which I really feel like was a missed opportunity. Especially since there's one battle in particular where Clive is getting attacked by an enemy and it turns into a QTE battle, and Sid and Torgal, who are in your party, are not involved. They're just standing there. They're not fighting other enemies. They're not actively helping Clive out. They're just watching Clive get his ass beat in this QTE section, and it just kind of felt really weird to me. And speaking of probably the biggest missed opportunity, Torgal. Everyone's best boy, everyone's favorite wolfhound companion, Torgal. I really feel like he was underutilized in the game's combat because his mechanics are fairly simple. It's essentially 3 commands, 2 attack commands and a heal. Up on the D-pad allows Torgal to get in there and fight the enemy. Down will launch an enemy up into the air, or if they're already in the air, it will send them down to the ground, and then he can heal Clive with a really slow regen type spell. But other than that, that's pretty much it. There's no cool team-up animation attacks between Clive and Torgal that I think would have looked great, but also would have freshened up combat against some of those smaller, less fun to fight enemies. Seeing maybe Torgal cast a spell that launches the enemy into the air, and then you see this cool camera angle where Clive flies up into the air and then stabs the enemy, or he pushes the enemy down into the ground with like a Titan attack, would have been sick. Because the chemistry between Clive and Torgal, it's there. We all love Torgal. I'm pretty sure I pet him like 100 times during my first playthrough, and not being able to utilize Torgal more and see that chemistry with some animations was a missed opportunity. And still speaking on Torgal, he doesn't even have his own skill tree, which I think would have been a really cool thing to implement. Imagine getting to level up Torgal alongside Clive, having him be faster, do more damage, have more defense. Maybe he can learn different spells and abilities that he could then utilize in combat, much like Clive, because spoiler alert, later on in the game we find out that Torgal is no ordinary wolf. He's a special wolf that's able to take different aspects of the dominance that he's been spending time with and kind of create his own abilities with them. He's a frost wolf essentially, and he even gets to transform into that form sometimes later in the game during certain battles. And seeing him do that was so cool. But imagine if we had a hand in leveling up Torgal and having him learn a sick new ability that slowed down time or activated like an iconic ability. I feel like that was a really missed opportunity, and just seeing the characters interact in battle would have been great, and that's something I think 15 does way better than 16's combat. And again, this is probably just super nitpicky because 16 is such an action game and it's so fast paced that maybe there isn't time to really slow things down to see a cool team-up attack between Clive and whoever he's with. But I still think about 15 to this day, and I understand what I'm about to say is super crazy, but if you were to put Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition and Final Fantasy XVI in front of me and ask me which game would I rather play through again, I'm gonna go with 15 Royal Edition. I know, it's sacrilege, the story's a mess, combat doesn't feel as good as 16, the open world is pretty barren. You're crazy, Corduroy, what are you doing? But it hit me in a time in my life where I really needed it. It was almost medicinal at points in time, and just being able to sit down and spend a few hours with the Chocobros, driving around the open world, hunting a monster down, hearing the banter between them, riding on Chocobos, eating cool food at a diner, that's stuff that I really loved. And it would have been nice to see more of that aspect in 16. But that is the video. Please let me know down below, are there other aspects of Final Fantasy games combat that you would have loved to see 16 utilize, whether it was from Final Fantasy 15 or 7 Remake or previous Final Fantasies? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure to also check out some of our previous videos here, talking about the Ever Crisis launch date and how we might see Rebirth sooner than we think. And then, of course, I have a video talking about the amazing, incredible music of Final Fantasy XVI, as well as 7 Remake. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.